very special guest, Stan Lee, everybody.
Here I am, alone and unprotected.
First, I want to just start by telling you a little bit about the documentary, because maybe you guys haven't heard of it or don't know about it. It'll be coming out April 27th. We've been on the documentary since 2006. It's been about 5 years. And, you know, there's been a lot of...
They're not the fastest crew in the world, I'll tell you that.
I've learned a tremendous amount just following Stan around at Comic-Cons and seeing how the fans, you know, the adoration they have for him and what he's created over the years, and you know, all of the history behind Marvel. It really opens your eyes. And I think of it in terms of, you know, in the 20th century, there's and I don't want to embarrass Stan, but there's
okay.
There's a handful of, you know, great creators, we always like to say. In the 20th century, there was, you know, Walt Disney, there's Stan Lee, there's...
Disney was good too.
Yeah, and there was Jim Henson, you know, George Lucas. I mean, basically, we're talking about one of the great 20th century creators. And in our push on this, we've chronicled like 553 characters that Stan has been a part of. But over the 5 years, we shot about 480 hours of footage. And what you're going to see later today is the final product of it. It's an 80-minute documentary.
You're going to actually show it to them? Free?
Yeah. Well, kind of. I think they paid $12.
Okay. So how much of that do I get?
$2. I don't know. When Martin left,
Yeah.
In 1970, did that affect the fans, the relationship that the company had with the fans?
No, Martin was just the publisher. He had nothing to do with the fans.
And after that was when you started the Soapbox and the Merry Marvel Marching
Oh,
Society.
no, I started the Soapbox before that.
Do you want to talk
yeah.
about how that initiative changed things with...
Oh, well, you're putting the whole burden on me. Huh? All right. When I started doing the Fantastic Four, for the first time, we started getting fan mail. We had never gotten fan mail before. I was at the company for years, and I was writing the stories the way my publisher wanted me to write them. And he used to say to me, don't use big words, words of more than 2 syllables. He thought the readers were either very young children or semi-literate adults. And he did not have much respect for our readership. And he said, don't worry about characterization and anything. Just give me a lot of action. They want to see a lot of running around and fighting and action. And I did that for years. Anyway, finally I decided I would try to do some stories that I might like to read. And we started with the Fantastic Four. Now, until then, we had never gotten fan mail. Maybe I'd get a letter once in a while that would say, see, our books were a dime at that time, and the letter might say, I got one of your copies, and there's a staple missing in the binding, I want my dime back. We'd get a letter like that, I'd put it on the bulletin board. Look, we got a letter from a reader. So after the Fantastic Four, we actually started getting letters. Now, I must be honest. In the beginning, most of the letters were written in crayon. After a while, they started to be written in pencil. A little bit later, in ink. A little bit later, they were actually typed. We had typewriters in those days. And then the return addresses, after a while, would be from a public school, then a high school. Then about a year after, we started with the Fantastic Four. And I don't remember the exact order, but then we did the Hulk and the X-Men and Spider-Man. Suddenly, we were getting letters from colleges and universities. So I knew we were onto something. But that had nothing to do with the publisher leaving or anything like that. He had nothing to do with
He was pretty
the actual...
open to letting you kind of do what you... run it how you wanted to.
Once he saw the success of the Fantastic Four,
He didn't
he
care.
gave me carte blanche. I could do anything I wanted,
Okay.
except make a lot of money. He did that.
No, one of the things that Stan is, known for is taking, go back to the 40s and the 50s. A lot of the illustrators and pencilers and inkers that, nobody really knew who they were. Stan would give them nicknames, start giving them credits on the front covers of the comics, and that actually helped build fan clubs, so to speak. For like guys like John Romita, Jazzy John Romita, and Darlene Dick Ayers, and
Well, what I wanted was I love the movies. I wanted to make our comics as much like the movies as possible. Oh, one thing I have to warn you of, I'm the world's biggest name dropper. So if I mention things like, I was talking to Steven Spielberg, many years ago, and Steven said to me, he said, Stan, you do essentially what I do, but my pictures move. I thought that was a very interesting statement. And in fact, I met Steven a couple of nights ago. I got an award for something, and he was there. And somebody said, gee, you were talking to Steven Spielberg. And I thought it was very funny. I replied by saying, I hope he doesn't get a swelled head. At any rate, the nicknames. So what I wanted to do was, up until then, the artists, the writers, the letterers, the colorists, they never signed their name. And nobody, most of the time, knew who wrote or drew a story. There was the story in the comic book, and that was it. So I decided to give credit to the writer, the artist, and so forth. And then I thought, that's kind of dull. I thought if I give them little nicknames, too, it would make the kids remember them and make it a fun thing. So I called Jack Kirby Jack King Kirby, and Steve Ditko Sturdy Stevie Ditko. He hated that. I called John Romita Jazzy John. He hated that too. Or John Ring-a-Ding Romita. Anything that came to mind. And most of them hated it. But it stuck in the readers' minds, and the readers began to get to know these guys and care about them. And just like in the movies, they started having favorite artists and favorite writers and so forth, and they would discuss it, and I liked that very much. I called myself Smilin' Stan, which was kind of icky. But then they started calling me, because there was a baseball player years ago named Stan Musial, and they called him Stan the Man, which I always thought was great, very macho. And then after a while, they started calling me Stan the Man, and I loved it, so that kind of stuck. So that's why I'm as macho as I am.
Let's talk about the importance of comics.
To people in the comic business, the rest of the world couldn't give a damn.
As an added boost to help their children with their reading.
Oh, yeah.
And going back several years back with Ronald. Stan in May will be getting the Ronald Reagan Great Communicator Award from the Reagan Presidential Foundation.
Not from him personally, but
that goes back decades, because they had an initiative years ago to try to reach out to kids and help them raise their reading scores through comics. Do you want to talk about that?
Not really, but you put me on the spot. I learned this accidentally. I guess there was a dearth of people who lectured at schools, and I used to get invitations to lecture at schools and colleges very often. And when I would go, whether it was a high school or a college, very often the instructors would come over to me and say, it's amazing. We never wanted people to read comics, but we find that some of our best writers and some of the ones who do best in literature and composition or whatever they teach in those places are the ones who read comics. And we realize that comics actually make them better readers and better writers. So I started giving this a lot of thought, thinking how it could turn to my benefit, because that's the kind of guy I am. And I realized after a while, the beautiful thing about comic books, they're one of the few things that young people will read on their own. You don't have to ask a kid to read a comic book. You may have to ask them to read Captains Courageous or something like that, but you have a comic book there, he'll grab it. You can't stop him from reading it. And what happens is they can't really understand the story unless they can read the words, unless they know what's happening. So they kind of force themselves to read it because they want to know, why is this guy punching that guy? And they read the story. And the more they read comics, the more they develop a facility at reading, and they become better readers. Now, once you become a reader, you don't just stick with one thing, then they start reading other things too. So I began to realize that what I was doing was almost a public service, and I couldn't understand why I had to pay taxes. It seems to me. But, you know, people, they don't care.
Was that when Reagan wrote the letter to you?
Yeah, I got letters from a lot of famous people about how great they think these comics are and so forth. And Reagan was one of the people who, you know, he was aware of that. In fact, I remember when he was elected president and they started writing about him in the paper, and one guy wrote that he interviewed Reagan, and he said he began every day reading Spider-Man in the newspaper. As you can imagine, I got a kick out of reading that. I don't sound very humble. You know, I can hear myself talking. I hope I'm not giving the wrong impression.
He's a very modest
I'm lousy
guy.
at this sort of thing. People hate me.
All right, I got an easy question for you. What does Excelsior mean?
Excelsior?
Yeah. And where does it come from?
I used to write a column called Stan's Soapbox in the comic books. Every month I would just talk to the readers like I'm talking to you, only much better. And I would end by saying things like, "Nuff said," or "hang loose," or "face front," or any stupid thing I thought of. Over at DC Comics, they were copying the hell out of what we were doing. And I started reading my little expressions popping up in the DC Comics books. And I didn't want that to happen. So I said to myself, I once said, I thought to myself, and my wife said, "You can't say that." I said, "Why?" She said, "Who else could you think to? It's a redundancy." So I'm very careful of that, but you can say it to yourself. So I said to myself, see, I like to give you the inner workings of my mind so you can learn from that. I said to myself, what was I talking about? Oh, yeah.
Excelsior, the origin.
I know. I said to myself, I've got to think of some expression that they won't copy in at DC, because A, they won't know what it means, they won't know how to spell it, and so I thought of Excelsior, because in Old English it means upward and onward to greater glory. I mean, what could be better? And then I found out it's actually the slogan of the Great Seal of the state of New York, and I lived in the state of New York. So it was not just a good idea, it was destiny. Excelsior!